In a couple of months from now, I'm going to celebrate the 40th anniversary of my first day as a journalist, if celebrate is the right word to use. It was the day I began a cadetship with Melbourne's afternoon newspaper, The Herald, now part of the Herald Sun. I stayed with the Herald for 8 years, and for most of that time, in the first half of the 80s, I covered industrial relations, working out of press rooms in the Arbitration Commission and the Trades Hall. There's a saying in journalism that it takes a very bad journalist to write a good story badly. That's as far as we can go with aphorisms and pieces of logic like that in journalism. This essentially means that good stories mostly write themselves. In many cases, all the journalist has to do is stand still and the story will happen around them. This was very much the case when I was an industrial reporter. Strikes were good for business, at least my business. The protagonists did their thing, you recorded it, reported it, and to keep them going, you bounced between one side and the other, giving them both an opportunity to ventilate. Then, of course, you welcomed the resolution and then waited for the next one and hoped for it, actually. Strikes, such a foundational element of our public, social and economic life going back to pre-Federation days, are no longer commonplace, but they were back then. It's a big change, actually, I think. No longer are train travellers stranded on platforms by wildcat action. It just makes me tear up just to even use that term, wildcat action. No more do drinkers fear that they might not have beer for Christmas. And no more do we suffer electricity blackouts, although actually if you live in South Australia you do still suffer electricity, but it's not for industrial reasons though, for other reasons. The last great blue-collar industrial dispute in Australia that was national, that dealt with an entire industry and not just one workplace, that threatened the very existence of the central employer and the union, and was actually prosecuted under and in some ways by a coalition government, was the Waterfront Dispute of 1997-98. Either side of that dispute were two big disputes in the aviation industry. The airline pilots' conflagration, really, in 1989, which involved the use of the military as strikebreakers and destroyed the pilots' union, essentially. And, of course, the Qantas dispute in 2011. They were profoundly important for their companies, but they also, I suppose, had nothing like the ambition, intrigue, and the sheer risk that the Waterfront dispute had. The Waterfront dispute quite memorably involved, and we've already heard a little bit, and I'm grateful to Stephen for providing a little bit of precursor to what I'm talking about, but images count for something, too much in modern life, sadly, but they still count for something. The Waterfront dispute did have balaclava-clad guards with dogs, probably the largest picket lines assembled in Australia. Some reports had picket lines in Melbourne at 4,000. Community involvement picket line, as well as Labor politicians and, of course, workers. Involved the sacking of an entire company's workforce using a corporate restructure and a series of courtroom showdowns so compelling that some of them were televised, just like in Law and Order, Tom. Unionism in Australia was clearly in decline, well in decline, when the Howard government came to office. In 1997, union density in the Australian workforce was 30%, down from 45% only 10 years earlier. That's quite a drop. The proportion of blue-collar workers in 1997 was higher, at 32%. And the trend, of course, as we know, has continued. Now unionism stands at 14% and only about 10%, I think, in the private sector, and only around 20% of workers are regarded as blue-collar. And yet, I contend that just as the vast bulk of Australians don't live in the bush, in fact they mostly stay away from it, but still romanticise it and see it and the people who live in it as quintessentially Australian, a fair number of Australians today retain a similar emotional or principled attachment to many of the protections afforded by unionism, even though they clearly aren't interested in joining unions or unionising their workplaces. Their attachment appears to centre on something almost ethereal, lingering notions of fairness perhaps. This is an important point to remember when considering the waterfront battle 20 years on. In many respects, the dispute was a dry run for a larger and vastly more definitive attempt at industrial relations reform by the Howard government in 2005-2007 in the form of work choices. The waterfront dispute delivered lessons about public sentiment that the government failed to heed, I believe, ultimately to its cost in 2007, but more of that later. It'd take more time than we've got to actually retell the story of this dispute, and it did my head in to have to go back into it and try and follow through the twists and turns. It was chronicled in a book, of course, a very good book, Waterfront, The Battle That Changed Australia, and it even became a mini-series on television, Bastard Boys. Gave quite a few of the participants very big heads, I might say, to see themselves played by actors. Now, I don't know if I'm using a kind of far too outdated or narrow cultural reference here, but do you remember Fantails, where you'd have the wrapper, you'd open it up and it'd have a little story about an actor or a singer like Fabian or, I don't know, Clint Eastwood or something? I'd like to just present you with a Fantail wrapper version of what happened in the waterfront dispute. Waterfront reform, which meant breaking the power of the Maritime Union of Australia in many respects, was on the Howard government's Monday morning shopping list when it took office in March 1996. This was a long-cherished dream of the non-Labor parties. There were legendary waterside disputes in the 1890s, 1917 and 1928, when a worker protesting about scab labour at Melbourne's Prince's Pier was fatally wounded by a policeman's bullet. Transport Minister John Sharp and Workplace Relations Minister Peter Reith were fully committed to getting a result in the first term. They were hot to trot, and they set about examining their options. By April 1997, the government had committed to an activist approach to end the MUA's closed shop, breaking the union, dramatically lifting productivity on the docks and ridding them of overmanning and feather bedding. Feather bedding is gets me a little bit nostalgic for my industrial reporter days too, actually. In September 1997, Sharp's ministerial career ended in an expensive scandal, as Stephen has mentioned, leaving Reith to run the government's program. An operation in Dubai, linked to Corrigan, aimed at training non-union workers, was exposed in November. The government claimed surprise. A new stevedoring operator, PCS, set up by the National Farmers Federation, began in Melbourne in January 1998. How are we going? Are you still following this? In April 1998, Patrick sacked its entire MUA workforce, revealing that it had restructured itself and was going into administration, but continuing to operate through 4 new companies that had been set up 7 months earlier, unbeknown to the employees. Again, the government expressed surprise. Public credulity was stretched at that point. The famous pickets followed. The union took legal action. The federal and high courts found largely, but not entirely, in favour of the MUA. The dispute was settled in June. Only half of the 1,400 MUA members at Patrick kept their jobs. The Patrick wages bill was slashed. Good news for Corrigan. Management prerogative was enhanced substantially, but the MUA and the closed shop survived. Patrick's share price soared. That's going to wrap around a very large fantail, I would suggest. What went right and what went wrong? And I'm mindful that Tom has asked us to nominate 3 areas where perhaps the government didn't do as well as it might have. There was a need for change. The government did effect change. It got a decent amount, I would say half of what it was after. Work practices improved and led to a better performance on our docks. If I'm to nominate 3 failings, they would be as follows. The government got the messaging wrong at the time and didn't take the public with it. I was privileged, actually, to be able to work with Peter Reith on turning his voluminous diaries into a book the Reith papers for Melbourne University Publishing in 2015. And we saw some of the diaries last night on our tour of the library. In their raw form, the diaries will prove to be an incredible resource for historians. They're amazing. They're not just diaries, they're scrapbooks, really. Peter was a truly remarkable political figure. He's still with us, but as a political figure he's quite remarkable. A man with a very thick skin, prodigious work ethic, and a determination to use politics to make a difference and to get up the nose of his direct opponents too, judging by what we've been told this morning. He knew from the outset that persuading the public to support waterfront reform would be a tough sell. After a briefing from Liberal Party pollster Mark Textor on April 4, 1996, just a month into power, he penned this diary entry, which I think is germane to how the community reaction played out. Waterfront, they, that's the public, don't know the problems, e.g. wage increases. They don't like wharfies having a job for life or Australia being held to ransom. First stage on IR and waterfront, inform people about the problems and how it is costing jobs. We want case studies on jobs lost, exports lost, but the punters say rorts are not news. So we need to say jobs for life costs jobs. Also we need global cases. There is no market or climate for change. That's interesting. So they're working from a blank slate. At the moment, there is no link to jobs, to debt, to small business. And yet, despite being very good at messaging in all sorts of other areas, the government never really hit on the right way to engage the public. Wharfies were blue-collar workers, not high flyers like pilots or politicians who were found to be rorting their expenses. Many Australians said, I think, good luck to watersiders who'd managed to negotiate a sweet deal through their union. The government was never able to put a price on how much MUA rorting was adding to the average household budget, which would have been more effective. What was it costing me? That's always what you have to go to. What's it going to cost me now? My second point would be that the government was ultimately seen to be too tricky on this. Graham Morris was quoted in Wayne Errington and Peter Van Onselen's biography of John Howard in 2007 with regard to the Dubai training operation. He said, "It looks slightly un-Australian and a bit sneaky, and I'm not sure how on earth the government got tied up in that sort of stuff." Well, the answer is that the government was dedicated to its version of reform, and by late 1997 was in the doldrums. It needed to do things. It needed to get things done. It was trying to dig itself out of a hole, and it believed in what it was doing. When the Dubai operation was revealed, Peter Reith said he didn't know about Dubai, which could well have been true, but he did know about some sort of operation, just not where it was. The questions were too specific to him. The man can think on his feet very, very well. Similarly, was he really shocked when the security guards and dogs moved in and Corrigan sacked his workforce? He wrote in the Reith papers that Corrigan, and this is a quote, a long quote, but I think it's worth going through, Corrigan played his cards close to his chest. My full support for him ensured that I was locked in with him whatever the outcomes. Not only was I always one step behind what Corrigan was up to, when I sought further information, the lawyers advised against seeking a briefing from Corrigan's legal team. The Commonwealth had legal advice to that effect by a well-known and respected silk. A minister who casts aside legal advice is taking a risk. I followed the advice, but it did mean that we were publicly supporting actions about which we had no precise information. Nor did we have any control over the events that were to unfold. That really is downhill skiing without a pole, isn't it, I think, for the Commonwealth. It is true that ignoring legal advice would have been a risk, but was there not a massive risk of losing the trust of the public on this issue by deliberately keeping yourself and the voters in the dark, which is actually what transpired? My third point would be that ultimately I think the government believed too much of its own rhetoric about the result and that was to its cost a little later on. The government had to convince the public and itself that it had not suffered any losses. Fair enough, that's the way politics works. In reality though, I believe it was a draw. Howard and Reith maintained at the time and much later that the retention of the closed shop was an annoyance and a minor matter. In the Reith papers, Reith said it was a pity, but that in practice the real issue was productivity, and the settlement gave Corrigan everything he needed. The long-term winners were the businesses that benefited from a more efficient waterfront. Howard, in his 2010 memoir, Lazarus Rising, said the MUA could argue that it succeeded in retaining its monopoly, but had paid a very high price to win. Who won the dispute? Mr. Howard wrote, the answer to that must clearly be Australian productivity. Now, confident self-talk is vital in politics, and John Howard was almost invariably one of the very best at taking a clear-eyed view of his surroundings. No question about that. But the failure to fully understand that the government had not managed to truly engage the community, either emotionally or intellectually, on further workplace relations after the Workplace Relations Act had come into force, was an oversight, I believe, that would come to hurt the government in 2005, when what came to be known as Work Choices was presented to the public only months after the 2004 election, having never been mentioned in the campaign. It was too much of a surprise, accompanied by, once again, I think, clumsy messaging that moved around. It was about unfair dismissals first, and then it was about something more, and then it wasn't really going to be that bad, and then left a lot of room for the unions to exploit. And ultimately, I think the government paid a very heavy price for the way that Work Choices was introduced. The pollster John Sturton concluded in 2007 that once the ACTU's Your Rights at Work campaign got up and running, a decisive 2% of voters shifted from the coalition to Labor and didn't return before that year's election. Again, unions were able to leverage a more fundamental understanding of the public's view of fairness in their favour. It's counterintuitive, of course, because the unions are not enormously popular, but something that they represent, I think, still lives on in the Australian mind, or at least enough of it to occasionally be decisive in elections still. So did the 1998 election, was the 1998 election affected by the Waterfront Dispute? No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Once it was out of the news, once the drama was over, same way as we forget about Australian Idol once it's they announced the winner, we moved on to something else. The next show was the real policy show for the first term of the Howard government, and that was the one that reached into every household and every business. The new tax system, based on a GST, and this was of electoral performance, I believe, large personal income tax cuts. Now, the MUA actually continues to be a highly militant union. We're still reading stories about them getting up to all sorts of rum behaviour, defecating into the boots of people they don't like, and all sorts of things like this, if you read the media still. And it's now attempting to merge with the CFMEU. A YouTube video promoting the merger declares that they will form Australia's toughest union, and that's in caps. Australia's toughest union is the way it's done. And in fact, the video, which I don't necessarily commend to you, but is full of stirring orchestral music in the style of like a Marvel superhero sort of movie, very, very, you expect someone very powerful to come through, and that's the whole idea of the video. This video closes with archival footage of a Melbourne picket line at the docks in 1998, picketers locking arms. That's what the MUA regards as its greatest moment. Thanks.
Shaun, can I ask you if the media in Australia lined up with both either Patrick's and the government or the MUA, and was it predictable from your perspective as a journalist at the time?
The financial press got behind the government. Editorialists got behind the government. Originally, I think the The gallery thought it was a good idea. The industrial reporters, of which I was not one, I was writing a column for The Age at that time, they were more sceptical, obviously. It's interesting for us to be talking about this dispute because it was right at the time, it was the very last conventional mainstream media dispute as well. The internet was not then commonplace. Definitely digital delivery of news was not commonplace. The idea of constantly rolling coverage and news getting super old very quickly was not the case. There was, of course, extensive rolling coverage of this dispute, and it began. I was talking to a friend of mine who covered it for The Age the other day, and he was saying that he'd get up in the morning and basically get a briefing on what was going on by listening to AM with Matt Peacock was the reporter covering it all. Matt's just taken a redundancy, and so he'd been on top of the story right from the beginning, and so he'd get a briefing there, then he'd start to move through, and then you'd basically be able to follow the story right through for the day, but it was a daily story going day after day after day. But the media, it's an interesting thing with the media, I think. It's always been a hard road to hoe, I know. I remember when I was actually covering industrial relations. The Australian media is a very middle-class institution, in my view. It draws most of its participants from the middle class. So they've never really quite understood what unions do or what blue-collar workers do. I don't feel... the tabloid newspapers try hard to reflect a better understanding of that, I think. But by and large, this was all a bit of a mystery. They all believe in whatever they're told, ultimately, in the media, as far as what workers do. And I think that's, again, I found that the same thing happened when work choices came about. It just seemed as though the media generally just thought this would just go straight through and it wouldn't be a problem, there wouldn't be a community backlash, and of course there was, very strongly.
Thank you. Your question, so if you just raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come to you, let us know your name, and then we'll look forward to hearing your question. Thank you.
Raka, my question is, why is the Liberal government or the coalition government so against unions? Like, traditionally, the Liberal government is very opposed to unions, so I was just wondering why that is.
Not always opposed to unions. I don't think they want to wipe out unions, just some maybe, but tame them generally. It makes sense, I think. They're much more about personal autonomy, about individual contracts, individual relationships, largely between workers and employers. And it goes back a long way. And I suppose, is it fair to say that's where a fair bit of the money that comes into the party comes from employers, definitely, rather than unions. And of course, unions are the Labor Party is the expression of the union movement, the political expression of the Labor movement, the union movement. So you would expect that the Liberals, almost by default, would line up on the other side.
You can sit down just for the camera.
Shaun, the mythology about the Waterfront Dispute is on a par with the Mabo judgment. Eddie Mabo actually failed in winning an important principle of native title. He himself failed. And so in the outcome of the Waterfront Dispute, it's remarkable that almost everyone believes that Chris Corrigan lost and the union won. All the union won was the right to continue to exist with a monopoly, maybe not recognised by the Howard government, but a monopoly that continued, but at the price of a dramatic increase in the loading of packets per hour, which they did in a doddle and have improved several times over. Chris Corrigan, who I note was a boy from Mittagong and a graduate of Barrel High School, had one of the most smashing victories in the history of industrial relations, and he's almost uncelebrated. I get the impression he prefers to be uncelebrated.
Yes, that's right. And he was new to the industry too, so he sort of came to the industry with a fresh eye. I couldn't believe some of the things that went on in terms of work practices, and he was used to doing well in business, and this was costing him quite a lot of money. So it was the government's great fortune that Chris Corrigan came along. Great fortune. He was just the right guy who was willing to take that unbelievable risk that he did, series of risks, commercially, to do what he did. And yeah, I mean, I think, one of the problems I think that probably stemmed, maybe not a problem, but one of the outcomes of the dispute was that there was an attempt to break the union monopoly on labour, but there was not really any attempt to break the duopoly in the stevedoring industry in terms of the commercial participants, and that was all to Chris Corrigan's great benefit. And yes, he's not someone who wants to be paraded around in the commercial media or anywhere else.
And indeed, when I contacted him earlier in the year for items for the Howard Library relating to that period, he said, I think I've got a few things and they're in a container. And so I think when he does return to permanent employment in Australia, I'm hoping that we can get that material to be a companion to the Wreath papers. You saw a little bit of them last night in the library. There's multiple PhDs. Rather than people thinking up topics that are not viable and that are boring, there are multiple PhDs in these papers, which are, in a sense, the cabinet notebooks you have when you're not allowed to have the cabinet notebooks.
And a footnote, Chris voted Labor lifelong. He might have stopped in 98, but I'm pretty certain he voted Labor in 96, and he was a regular at ALP fundraising events.
Has he ever come back?
Question from over this side.
Hello?
Shaun, I wonder if you could say something about the High Court decision, because as I recall it, there were two principles that were involved. One was the freedom to structure your corporation as you wished. The other was whether or not this would be seen as a shield defeating industrial relations legislation. And it was a bit of a shock, I think, to the government when the High Court came down with the decision that it was. In all of what happened to me, that was the biggest surprise. So I wonder if you could comment on that. And my second question would be this. Do you think these days, with a more literalist High Court, the decision would be other than it was back then?
The answer to the second is yes, I do, based on what we saw just recently. I suspect there's much greater chance of that, and it was quite a shock. Well, I don't know how much of a surprise it was that Justice Tony North in the federal court, ruled in the first instance, mostly in favour of the MUA. The decision of the appeal bench, the full bench of the federal court, I think there was a bit more expectation that things might go a bit better for the company than they did. And then in the High Court, as I recall, all the members of the High Court ruled in that, which was unusual at the time, and that was quite a surprise. I'm not a lawyer, but there were a number of interesting decisions being made then, and I must confess, from the media's point of view, there was a little bit of a belief, it's just a folk belief, that the community kind of upswell of sentiment might have guided some of the decisions that were made. That's no disrespect to the court.
But you do think there was a legacy of this dispute for the way that people regarded, if not the messaging, the substantive policy changes associated with work choices?
I do think
you were trying to draw that at the end.
Yes, I do. I do think that there's a sort of counterintuitive thing going on in society still about notions of fairness. I think it's just come back to that, notions of fairness in society, and might not even be a majority of Australians. Probably not, but a decisive enough cohort to be electorally still important, I think, and yeah, the voters like we all like to be told stories. I don't think the voters were told very convincing stories in either 97, 98 or in 2005, 2007 on workplace relations. Doesn't mean it can't happen again, but where are we? The experience of work choices was so searing that really the coalition continues to be gun-shy on industrial relations reform 10 years later. Fiddles around at the edges, wants to go after CFMEU. That's about it.
Thank you. And a final question over here. Thank you.
Hi, Shaun. Thanks very much for your very considered comments.
Thank you.
I'd like to take issue with you about this connection between Waterfront and work choices. I was lucky enough to be around for the first one and not for the second. I think they were completely different things, completely driven by different forces at different stages of the government and with different makeups of parliament and all sorts of things. So I just wanted to, I guess, make that point. I think there was, as you rightly said, strong commitment to waterfront reform, productivity improvement, and other industrial changes at that first time. But I just wanted to say that I think that they were very different things, and they shouldn't. I think conflagrating them, I think, is an error.
Fair enough. I tend to think that I take your point. I appreciate it. I do tend to think, though, that it's still, I think, a problem inside, if I may, just offer this view. I think there's a problem for the government as it stands now, that it isn't pursuing something on industrial relations, because, and I think that's been the case all the way through the life of this government since 2013, and maybe before when it was in opposition, because I think there are kind of animal spirits inside the party that do want more to be done, and it's sort of denying its own nature not to be doing more. That's why I do see a through line, and I do talk about the sort of explanation and messaging of it, the authenticity, if you like, of some of those motivations that I think still exist inside the party. But I appreciate what you say about differences in personal makeup, and of course Peter Reith left the Parliament and different ministers, all that sort of stuff. It's all a different thing. But yeah, that would be my view. Thanks.
Would you please join with me in thanking Shaun?